again. It's Spencer Hess here for our third episode on Native by Caitlin B. Curtis. This discussion will wrap up talking about the book proper, and in the weeks ahead we'll be talking about the so-called professional managerial class and the ubiquity of therapeutic culture, and how this book is symptomatic of that, and vice versa. This episode is entitled Rad Magical Liberalism, Sterile Seeds, because we're going to recapitulate my argument about how she and all the radical liberals like her don't actually understand how systems work. And because of that, their politics are impotent, sterile, if you will. But to recapitulate in brief the last few talks, Caitlin B. Curtis identifies as a Potawatomi woman first and a Universalist Christian second, and she belongs to the mystical body / the folk soul of her people. At the highest level, her theory intellectually looks like a fusion of postmodern deconstruction and decolonial theory and liberation theology. And at a lower level, looks a whole lot like angry social justice warrior politics. At a more practical level, it looks like her raising children that identify as Potawatomi and writing books like Native. Before we get any further, I want to formally define Rad-Lib, which is hard to find an official definition for, so I resorted to Urban Dictionary, the world's most accurate dictionary, which defines it as short for radical liberal, used as an insult among leftist groups for people who claim to be radicals or leftists, often to feel good about themselves, but express liberal, uninformed, or otherwise non-leftist views about important topics such as capitalism, reformism versus revolution, LGBTQ plus rights, gender politics, or sometimes just people who support Joe Biden. In this case, I'm using it to say someone who seems radical, but has otherwise non-leftist views about specifically capitalism, and at best believes in reform, and I'm not even convinced she believes in that. Now, adroit listeners will be wondering why I brought up reification and magical thinking last week and said I would resume them, and didn't, and it's because I wanted to lead into this discussion with one more coating of paint on systems and her incorrect understanding of them. While I've got the slide up, according to Wikipedia, the world's most accurate encyclopedia, the precise definition of magical thinking may vary subtly when used by different theorists or among different fields of study. In anthropology, the posited causality is between religious ritual, prayer, sacrifice, or the observance of a taboo, and an expected benefit or recompense. Later research indicates that magical thinking is also common in modern societies. What I want to focus on there is the posited causality is between ritual, prayer, sacrifice, or the observance of a taboo, and an expected benefit or recompense. So let's pick up. If you recall, we ended last week's session talking about how her being horrified to learn what the nation state and corporations do to indigenous peoples when they want to dig a pipeline through their treaty territories. Now, why she would be seemingly surprised by this fact, given that she maintains correctly that America was founded from the beginning, at least in part, she would argue in total, by white supremacy, slavery, and genocide on the native peoples. Why she would be surprised, I'm not fully clear. But anyway, she grabs a guitar and her kids and hits the streets for her very first protests. And she writes that on those streets, marching with others, I knew the future is the children, and that, quote, the answers lie within the kinship relations between indigenous and non-indigenous and the lands we both inhabit, unquote. She writes that she saw a Palestinian man marching with us that day, and as we passed by him, he just nodded and said, I know what you're going through. I stand with you. I know that for the Potawatomi spirit to continue to burn brightly, our children must carry the flame into the next generation, and that if we let them, they will. And I just want to park it there because here's another example of the magical thinking. In the case of Israel, Palestine, you want to talk about a settler colonial state. and in recent history, imposing Israeli ideas and bodies on Palestinian bodies and spaces. The idea that a Palestinian man having solidarity with a protest in Atlanta that's protesting a pipeline being built in Dakota is going to make a tremendous amount of difference. And also to publish this book in 2020 as the pipeline continued to go forward. I just don't get it. I can only understand it as a form of magical thinking. That somehow or other, if we all agree that something is wrong, then that wrongness is going to stop. And some of you might have been feeling throughout the past week some sort of vague sense of deja vu. Like, where have I encountered a similar, strange sort of argument in pop culture? For each and every one of you, I know. And the answer is Season 2, Episode 17 of South Park, which has the famous Underpants Gnomes that became a meme.
This is where all our work is done.
So what are you gonna do with all these underpants that you steal?
Collecting underpants is just phase 1. Phase 1, collect underpants.
So what's phase 2?
Hey, what's phase 2? Phase 1, we collect underpants. Yeah, but what about phase 2? Well, phase 3 is profit, get it?
I don't get it.
You see, phase 1, collect underpants. Phase 2, phase 3, profit.
The Underpants Gnomes are just a relatively famous, and at this point old, meme on the internet to just mock any kind of bad plan that hasn't been thought through. As it relates to Caitlin Curtis here, her plan is to yell at unjust systems to stop and be nice. There's an unknown second phase, and phase 3 is social justice. Or more to the point, her plan's more like be really nice, speak truth to power, assert your identity, but only if you're a minority. Support BIPOC-owned businesses and artists. Low-key, she's saying vote blue no matter who. Step 2 is a big unknown, but it has something to do with the children. Step 2 is the children. Phase 3 is diversity, equity, inclusion, etc. Peace on earth, truly democratic socialism, or something like that. 1,000 beautiful flowers blooming, and reverse climate change. Another term that C. Derek Varn, who used to be over at Zero Books, turned me on to recently is the idea of a cargo cult, which is associated with indigenous peoples when they've had contact with more technologically developed people, usually during the world wars, that would give them their goods or share with them their goods, whether it's canned foods or medicine or weapons or whatever. And then they leave. That sometimes a cult develops where the natives try and do these magical rituals to make the technology and the goods return. And my argument is, to the extent we have a left in America, especially exemplified by the DSA, which is this point from C. Derek Varn I'm stealing, it's really that by stacking up a list of the historical injustices that have been done and a sermon about how it's all wrong, then somehow or other the Democrats and America generally will lavish on them the communism that they've been holding at bay the whole time. And it's totally insane, I think. Or a total religion, which is fine if you have a cult with claims about faith and the metaphysical nature of reality. But if you're any kind of materialist, you can't believe this. You have to believe that we need politics and we need systems and we need collective organization to bring this about, not magical rituals to convert bad people into good people. And with this wider context of cargo cults and Underpants Gnome logic, a whole lot of passages in her book make a lot more sense than if they're taken seriously and literally and unironically. We live in an era in which the young people are leading us. They are leading us on issues of gun control. They are leading us on issues of climate change. They are leading protests and marches and making phone calls to their senators. They are changing systems that must be changed. Some of them are showing up to vote because they know that they are the holders of the future. They know that they have a chance to change things, and we should give them everything they need to do it. Or how about this one? For those who have held the power, breaking systems of patriarchy can be scary, but in the end, it benefits everyone because it allows all voices to be heard and valued for who they are and what they have to give. We are watching this happen with Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and other congresswomen who are dismantling the patriarchal systems of America by shining a light on how much power many generations of white men have held in the White House. And now we come to the Rediscovering God segment, which I don't want to talk about too much because, as I said early on, it's all so boring. The long and the short of it is she used to be a Republican with a fundamentalist understanding of Christianity, and now she's a Democrat with some sort of Unitarian Universalist understanding of Christianity. Very influential for her was Rachel Held Evans, who was known as this left liberal voice in evangelical Christian circles. She has a tribute to her at the end of the book. She writes that Rachel was someone who challenged the seemingly set-in-stone world of Christianity to ask how it treats its most vulnerable people: women, people of color, LGBTQ plus people, disabled people, and children, among others. I kind of wonder, what are the others that haven't been listed? But anyway, Rachel asked if we read the Bible the way we should read it, and help us come to the conclusion that God is always bigger and love is always wider than we'd imagined. She also writes that she met Rachel a few years into the process of deconstructing her own Christian faith, at a critical time in her life when church and community were difficult to come by. This woman, who led so many others to a vision of an inclusive church, was taking a chance on me, and I wasn't sure why. Rachel not only read my words and told me that they mattered, she also took my hand and led me to a Christianity that I did not know existed, one that included all the questions I had and the ones I didn't even know were coming. She showed me that when the church gets to work, good things happen, and we find healing. Rachel led me to more questions. Rachel led me to a deeper faith. And again, on the one hand, I'm sure Rachel Held Evans, I haven't delved into her work. I'm sure it's fine. But to me, this is one more example of Curtis's naivete. She's got some affiliations, and the book gets an endorsement from Nadia Bowles-Weber, whose book Accidental Saints, Praying to God and All the Wrong People, is a way, way, way better book than this, and I would highly recommend to people. She cites Richard Rohr, who also endorsed this book, who wrote The Universal Christ a few years ago. He is a Franciscan, and she alludes to him with this passage here where she writes, "This, the universal Christ, who in grace and love holds all things and all people and all creatures in that grace, is what gives me hope in this world. The universal Christ, who is not a colonizer, who does not seek after profit, or create empires to rule over the poor or to oppress people, is constantly asking us to see ourselves as we fit in this sacredly created world. It is what my Potawatomi ancestors saw when they prayed to Kekmanodo, to Mamagosnan, and is what our relatives still see when they pray today, a sacred belonging that spans time and generations and is called by many names. Today, it is what I continue to see in my own faith, not a Christianity bound by a sinner's prayer and an everyday existence ruled by gender-divided Bible studies and accountability meetings, but a story of faith that's always bigger, always more inclusive, always making room at a bigger and better table of lavish food that has already been prepared for everyone and for every created thing." And again, like with so much of this book, I don't object to 90% of it. Of course, God is broader and wider and has bigger plans than those conceived of in the narrow bounds of her Baptist fundamentalist Christianity that she was raised in. I would raise, it's worth raising the question, has she gone too far? Is every religion more or less on an equal footing because they're all just avatars of God? I don't know. This is beyond the scope of this talk, whether or not Universalists and the Baha'i and whatever else are right. And the only other thing I want to point out before we leave this, is she has not left accountability meetings behind. But now it's not a Baptist morality meeting. It's a SJW accountability meeting, which to me both shows how far she's come, but also how not very far she's come at all. So covering all of this is still a Southern Baptist preoccupation with right behavior and right belief. It's just been turned on its head. Now it's to accept everyone, no matter what, instead of we have this very narrow view of what is acceptable behavior and acceptable belief. And now the irony is that narrow view is seemingly the only thing excluded, that the only thing forbidden is to forbid, as Zizek likes to say. And if this was just all her personal beliefs, whatever. But the problem is, large swaths of the country think this way. And in the face of real problems, whether it's various industrial and technological revolutions, whether it's the climate change that is the inevitable carbon consequence of those revolutions, whether it's oil pipelines, necessary, I would argue, to fuel the society we currently have, whether it's the rise of neo-fascist groups in Europe, or whatever the sort of libertarian, Tea Party, Trumpian strains in American society are leading to next. And even in the face of the Biden administration's inability to do much of anything other than pull out of Afghanistan, which I think is pretty rad. And in part, this exists because on the spiritual side of things, she has lost sight of the grave existence and challenge of evil and sin and death. And she has reduced it to evil is bad people who are exclusionary and aren't sufficiently open, who then create systems of oppression and repression and violence and exclusion and meanness, which I'll grant is a key part of how evil exists, but it doesn't factor in the way that to be as good as she thinks she wants everybody to be would require so much self-sacrifice and would require so much interpersonal collaboration that it may well be more than the flesh can bear. And it would require facing up to a world that is dominated by the abstract logic of capital. And that is a big, big, big problem. And in the face of these problems, which she vaguely discerns, she can only offer her identity and a left liberal moralization based on that identity, and sermons in favor of education, creating better youths who are somehow or other going to fix society, and an anarchoid fetish of protesting and letting our voices be heard in the streets to hopefully elect a bunch of Democrats who supposedly we're going to be able to hold accountable to actually push forward radical reforms that will stack on top of each other so that we have a truly socially just revolution.
I don't get it.
So on that cheery note, I'll end this talk with the same question that I ended the last talk. Do you agree with Caitlin B. Curtis that we live in a liberal society and we should just be liberals with various degrees of radicality and enthusiasm? Or am I right, and as long as a critical mass of people believe and think and act just like she does, or rather doesn't, are we in a whole lot of trouble? Up shit creek without a paddle, as it were. And I encourage you to think about, to what extent are you and all the people around you just like her?
You bet we do. Us gnomes are geniuses at corporations.